Warning! Kinda Murdery contains adult themes, explicit language, and descriptions of violence. It is not suitable for anyone, and we recommend you stop listening now.
True crime with a dash of the paranormal, the garish, the strange, and the darkly comic. I'm Zevin Odelberg, host of Kinda Murdery, a podcast that's about more than just murder. It's my very own pocket dimension, home to a curated collection of bizarre and compelling stories, the unsolved, the unsettling, and the unbelievable. I cover it all, just so long as it's kinda murdery. That is correct. Just like it says in the intro, I am Zevin Odelberg, and this is Kinda Murdery. You've found your way to Part 3 of Murder at the Elegante Hotel. That's right, I said Part 3, so if you haven't heard Parts 1 and 2 yet, go listen to them. Then rejoin us. We'll save you a seat. If you've already heard Parts 1 and 2, then you're good to go. As for me, I'm gonna jump right into it. Today's episode is the thrilling conclusion of this bizarre mystery that we've been covering regarding the murder of Greg Flanagan and exactly what happened in room 348 at the Elegante. And it's a little longer than usual, so I don't want to waste any time. If you'll recall, in part 2, detectives Apple and Brennan discovered that in fact Greg Flanagan had not been crushed by a heavy object, beaten to death, or otherwise killed by blunt force trauma. No, in fact, he had been shot. And the revelation that he was killed by a bullet led the detectives to revisit the electricians who had been staying in the room next to 348. As today's episode opens, they're interviewing Tim Steinmetz. And with that, please join me as we uncover what truths we can and solve what mysteries we may. Kinda Murderies, Murder at the Elegante Hotel, Part 3, the thrilling conclusion, starts now. The atmosphere felt almost congenial in the Chippewa County Sheriff's Department interview room, where detectives Apple and Brennan were interviewing Tim Steinmetz, one of the electricians who had been staying in the room next to 348, along with his friend Lance Mueller on the fateful night when Greg Flanagan was killed. Steinmetz likely felt a sense of relative ease, given the formal yet non-aggressive demeanor of the Texas detectives. He settled into a swivel chair on his side of the wooden table. Across from him, the detectives sat with their notebooks laid open, files within easy reach, all elements of a conventional investigative process. Graciously, they thanked Steinmetz for his cooperation, emphasizing that this was all standard procedure. But beneath the thin veneer of routine lay the weight of an unresolved death, a puzzle that had led these officers across state lines, chasing leads that had grown cold over the past 7 months. Steinmetz may have reassured himself that sticking to his pre-rehearsed story would keep him insulated. After all, no one likes to think of themselves as part of someone else's tragedy. Yet, here he was, unavoidably connected to the fate of a man who had died just a wall away from him in a Texas hotel. Although it's likely that Steinmetz found comfort in the detective's polite professionalism, it was this very courtesy that could be the most disarming. The officers were trained to walk the tightrope between comfort and confrontation, setting the stage for what could become a pivotal moment in a perplexing case. Tension hung heavy in the air, palpable yet unspoken as the detectives began their questioning. It's settings like these where rehearsed stories meet the crucible of scrutiny, where a person's words can either bring resolution to a grieving family, or dig a deeper hole of mystery. And so, with notebooks open and pens poised, the detectives began. On one side of the table, Steinmetz had his story straight, buttoned up. But on the other side, the detectives had a puzzle with missing pieces, and they were determined to find them. The question was, would the words spoken here today fit into the puzzle, or blow the case wide open? The weight of unspoken truths loomed as the interview commenced, and Tim Steinmetz, no doubt, felt the gravity of the moment whether he showed it or not. Up until the moment that Steinmetz signed his statement, he probably thought everything was fine. The atmosphere in the room was almost friendly. The detective seemed satisfied. His statement had been diligently written, corrected, initialed, and notarized. Steinmetz might even have felt a modest sense of relief as he prepared to leave. Is that it? He asked, rising from his seat. Hang on a second. Detective Brennan's voice shifted dramatically. It was, until you signed that statement. But now, you've got a problem. Suddenly the room was transformed. The congeniality vanished, replaced by palpable tension, even fear. Steinmetz had unwittingly crossed an invisible boundary. The signed statement had furnished the detectives with the leverage they needed to demand more from him. Signing a false statement to the police can be prosecuted as a felony. For Steinmetz, the stakes were now perilously higher. Feeling cornered, he sat back down, suddenly aware that he was ensnared in a situation far more precarious than he'd originally thought. All of the detective's friendliness had evaporated, like a puddle of cat piss on a summer sidewalk in Texas. The signed paper before him became a weight, pulling him into a reality far more grave. And then, like a dam breaking, the real story spilled out, a narrative far darker and more fraught than his initial testimony. This was not a simple tale of men in a hotel room. It was a scene fraught with imminent danger, fueled by alcohol and recklessness. The electricians had all been hanging out at room 349, drinking after work, when Lance Mueller, 3 sheets to the wind, began brandishing a 9mm Ruger handgun, as if it were a toy, his judgment obviously impaired, perhaps obliterated by alcohol. In that moment, a chilling sensation washed over Steinmetz. He felt an immediate surge of adrenaline and dread as Mueller aimed the gun at him. He hit the floor instinctively, cursing at Mueller for his senselessness. Trent Pisano, also present, felt a cold shock run down his spine, unsure in that moment whether he would be shot as Mueller pointed the gun in his direction. And then it happened. The deafening sound, the concussion of a gun firing. A bullet punched through the room, narrowly missing Pisano and lodging itself into the wall. Or so they thought. Mueller, perhaps coming to grips for the first time with the gravity of his reckless actions, was panic-stricken. He scurried to his car to return the gun, leaving behind a room filled with shock and indignation. Pisano, disgusted and unnerved, retreated to his own room. The incident was not just a cautionary tale, but a damning episode that exposed a life-threatening lapse in judgment. It was a moment that underscored the perilous conjunction of alcohol, firearms, and human fallibility. After returning the gun to his car in a panic, Lance Mueller was desperate to erase any evidence of his reckless behavior, and he decided to patch the bullet hole. But he didn't use plaster or any other conventional materials because he didn't have those on hand. Instead, he used toothpaste. With a sense of urgency driven by the haunting realization of just how badly things could have turned out, he slathered the toothpaste into the hole, smoothing it out in an amateur attempt to make it disappear. It was a moment that symbolized the futile efforts to cover up actions that had become dangerously consequential. Toothpaste, a mundane item typically associated with daily routine, was now part of an unsettling narrative, a flimsy cover over a gaping wound, both literally and metaphorically. It was a desperate, almost childish act that belied the gravity of the situation. Patching the bullet hole with toothpaste was a metaphor for the broader failure of judgment that evening, a cover-up, poorly executed, and unlikely to hold up to any real scrutiny. Although, as we now know, hold up it did, for many months. When Tim Steinmetz finally spilled the beans on what really happened that fateful night, including Mueller's attempt at playing handyman with a tube of toothpaste, it underscored the absurdity and the horror of the entire situation. It wasn't just about a bullet hole in a wall. It was about holes in their stories, their judgment, and perhaps the fabric of their moral compasses. And all these holes couldn't be filled with a tube of Crest. The true story was out, and Steinmetz's demeanor was a mix of relief and trepidation as he leaned back in his chair, staring at the notepad where his second statement, the true statement, was laid out in black ink. He had reached the point of no return. When he and Mueller had heard that soft cough from the room next door after returning from the bar past midnight, they had become aware of the presence of their neighbor for the first time. And then when the man had died, they kept their activities to themselves, secretly worried about the consequences. When Steinmetz saw the police presence and the gurney being rolled out of room 348 the next morning, his heart sank. "I thought he'd killed that guy," Steinmetz confessed to Brennan. His voice was tinged with a sense of regret and a palpable concern over the gravity of their actions, now starkly manifest in the tragedy that had unfolded next door. What had started as an evening of friends getting sloshed and blowing off steam after a hard day's work had spiraled into a horror show of reckless behavior, amplified by the irresponsible handling of a loaded gun, and then escalated into something darkly irrevocable, the murder of an innocent man. Now, burdened by this revelation and its weighty implications, Steinmetz understood that there was no going back. The recklessness that had once seemed thrilling was revealed for what it truly was, a dangerously negligent act that had altered lives forever. The line between mischief and morality had been perilously thin, and they'd crossed it. No, they'd obliterated it. Steinmetz had laid his cards on the table. There was that one minor detail, a detail that neither Brennan nor Apple seemed too keen on. It was a nagging discord in an otherwise harmonious narrative. The cough from behind the closed door of room 348. This seemingly innocuous sound had the weight of implication, for if in fact it was true that Steinmetz had heard the cough, it suggested that Greg had clung to life far longer than any medical theory had accounted for. This piece of information was unsettling for both the detectives and Tim Steinmetz, albeit for different reasons. For the detectives, it was an incongruity they were willing to overlook. Their primary objective was to reconstruct the chain of events that led to Greg's demise, not to determine his exact time of death. Moreover, Steinmetz and his friends were intoxicated on the night in question, further compromising the reliability of their memory. But for Steinmetz, clinging to the detail of the cough was akin to holding onto a lifeline, an ounce of exoneration. It may not have mattered legally, but morally? Ethically? Well, that was a different story. As Steinmetz sat there, grappling with the realization of his own failure to act, to knock on the neighboring door, the weight of it all loomed over him. He was halfway through a personal reflection, musing on what he could or should have done differently, when the atmosphere in the room shifted palpably. Brennan and Apple had another task for him, something else they wanted Steinmetz to do. The moment of introspection was cut short. It was as if the room had collectively decided that there was a line of ethical questioning that would remain uncrossed. For now. Steinmetz's unfinished thoughts lingered in the air, a haunting reminder of the human dimensions that lurk behind the sterile facts of a criminal case. It felt like 2 outs in the bottom of the ninth in a one-run baseball game. Bases loaded, full count, 3-2. Pitcher and batter wiping sweat from their brows. Everyone on the edge of their seats, hollow dread gnawing away at their stomach lining. The detectives had given Steinmetz a task. He dreaded their instruction, and yet had no choice but to comply. And so, Tim Steinmetz picked up his cell phone to call Lance Mueller. "Hey Lance, what's up?" he asked, his voice warbling with tension and dread. "Not much," said Mueller. "Just sitting around." "Well, I just got back from down there," said Steinmetz. "How'd it go?" Steinmetz hesitated, his conscience at war with instincts for self-preservation. Finally, he fessed up. "Well, I told him the whole story, you know, what happened, that we were sticking to there, you know." "What's that?" "You know, the story that we were sticking to, that we got home late that night, you know, and the guy coughed and whatever." "Right. And, Steinmetz's voice faltered. "And I was fixin', I was just gonna leave it there, because your lawyer said it would be okay, right, you know?" "Right. And when I left it there, they said, okay, you know, tell us the truth. So I told him the truth, what really happened." Silence ensued on the other end of the line, a cavernous echoing void that hung heavily in the air. It was as if time itself had frozen. "You mean about the gun going off and all that?" Mueller finally asked, breaking the silence. "Yep. And what did they say?" "Well, that I would be in trouble, you know, if I didn't tell him." The air grew thicker. Another long silence. "So, Tim, what did they say?" "Well, not much. I mean, I don't know if they're going to get a hold of you or Trent or what the hell they're going to do." Mueller sighed audibly, a noise resembling the death rattle of a wounded animal. Then he groaned. "What'd they mean by that? I mean, tell us the truth. Did they say anything about the gun prior to that or what?" No, they just said they knew exactly what happened. They told me to stop fucking lying. They were pretty pissed. And then I told them exactly how everything went down and what really and truly happened." "Are you shitting me, Tim?" Mueller's voice had a dangerous edge. No, I'm not." "Oh my God. Are you kidding me? Are you serious right now?" "I'm serious as a heart attack, Lance." Here, the human mind's capacity for self-deception reveals itself in Mueller's incredulity. Despite all the evidence stacking up against him, Mueller refused to connect the dots between the gun and the man's death. Doesn't make sense, Tim. At first the coroner ruled that it was a heart attack, then they started saying something fell on him. There's no way. There's absolutely no way that guy was killed by a bullet. How you doing, Lance? Steinmetz asked. How you feeling? How's your state of mind? How am I doing? Mueller shot back. Not good, Tim. I need to drink some more beers. As the weight of the revelations had begun to sink in, Mueller resorted to a familiar coping mechanism, booze. Then, later, inebriated, he called Brennan, mumbling his desire to make a statement. "You drunk," Brennan told him. "Hang up the phone and call your fucking attorney." And so this tale unravels, layer by disturbing layer. The dissonance between Steinmetz and Mueller reveals a fraught psychological landscape, where truth wrestles with illusion, and moral choices clash with self-interest. The tragic irony here is that these men had an opportunity, however late, to act on their conscience. Yet, it seems that they chose the path of least resistance, rationalizing their actions until the grim truth cornered them. The choices we make in the shadows always find their way into the light. As Brennan sat in the courtroom, he could feel a sense of unease settling over him like a dense fog. The judge's initial words seemed to dismiss the gravity of the situation, characterizing it as a terrible accident. It was October 29, 2012, and Brennan had traveled to Beaumont, joining Susie Flanagan, Scott Apple, and others from Greg's inner circle. They were all gathered for a solemn purpose, to hear the sentencing of Lance Mueller, the electrician who had entered a no-contest plea to manslaughter. The words "terrible accident" hung in the air, charged with unsettling tension, and in Brennan's opinion, not near enough truth. Was this what it had come down to? Years of investigation, unraveling truths layer by excruciating layer, only for the conclusion to be framed as a mere accident? Brennan's thoughts turned to Greg's family and friends present in the courtroom. How would they perceive this? How would they feel about this? What would it mean for them, for justice, and for the larger narrative of personal accountability? To Brennan, the judge's words struck a dissonant chord, like a child mashing piano keys at random. This wasn't just a terrible accident. It was an event that had unfolded due to a series of choices. Some passive, some active, but choices nonetheless. Choices that irrevocably altered the course of multiple lives. Calling it a terrible accident almost seemed to minimize those choices and, by extension, the life that had been lost and the lives that had been impacted. It suggested an absence of intent, a mitigating circumstance. But what of the mitigating circumstances for Greg, for his family, and his friends? They were absent, replaced by stark, irreversible reality. Brennan's apprehension could have been the apprehension of anyone who's ever sought justice, ever looked to the legal system for some form of closure. Could the sentence capture the intricate layers of morality, of human failure and frailty woven into this tragedy? Or would it miss the mark, settling for an explanation that skirted the uncomfortable complexities? You could cut the tension in the room with a butter knife. The stakes were high. Whatever the judge's final words would be, they had to serve as the concluding chapter of a story that had been fraught with suspense, drama, and heartbreak. It was a story that had started in the cold anonymity of a hotel room, and had led everyone present in the courtroom on a grim journey through the mazes of human behavior, and now, justice. As Brennan awaited the judge's next words, he was confronted with the reality that sometimes the system can only provide so much clarity or solace. And, as the courtroom held its collective breath, the weight of that reality pressed heavily on all present. This was the moment that would answer the lingering questions, bring closure, or perhaps leave an unfillable void in the hearts of those seeking justice for Greg, just like his absence would leave a void that would be unfilled forever. When the judge parted his lips to speak again, Brennan's pulse quickened, his thoughts echoing the collective anxiety that filled the courtroom. "Oh, fuck," he found himself silently exclaiming. "Here it goes. Don't tell me this guy's gonna get a fucking year or something." But then, plot twist. The judge began an articulate recitation of the recklessly irresponsible choices that had created the entire tragedy. Every decision was laid bare, each one scrutinized under the cold light of judicial review. This is more like it, Brennan thought, and the tightness in his chest eased ever so slightly. Finally, there was acknowledgement of the casual sequence, the chain of human errors and willful neglect that had culminated in an irreversible tragedy. There was no glossing over, no sanitation of the uncomfortable facts. The cataloging of irresponsible choices acted like a bridge, connecting the legal proceedings to the raw emotional reality that Greg's family and friends had been grappling with. It seemed to say, this wasn't just something that happened. This was something that was caused. And now, there must be accountability. For Brennan, that moment was redemptive in its own way. It was an affirmation that their efforts, tireless investigations, countless interviews, and the arduous journey through the maze-like legal system were not in vain. This was not a simplistic rendering of events as a, quote, terrible accident, unquote, but rather a nuanced understanding that situated the tragedy in a context of avoidable human failure. As the judge continued speaking, there was a collective, albeit quiet, exhale in the courtroom. It was as if everyone had been holding their breath, waiting for this very moment, when the system, often seen as coldly analytical, showed a glimpse of its humanity by recognizing the gravity of the mistakes made. Brennan almost wanted to get up and applaud. And so, as the long list of irresponsible choices was delineated, one couldn't help but feel a subdued sense of vindication. It was a sobering acknowledgement that actions have consequences, that choices matter, and that, in the final analysis, justice, however imperfect, seeks to reconcile the scales that were so tragically tipped. As the gavel struck, the courtroom seemed to inhale a collective breath of finality. The judge had sentenced Lance Mueller to 10 years, only half of the maximum penalty that the law permitted. Mueller's courtroom apology, which seemed tinged with genuine remorse, felt to many like a futile act of contrition. Too little, too late. From the beginning, Mueller had been running an insidious game of calculated risks, or perhaps uncalculated risks, but still. His reckless decision to play with a firearm while in a drunken state was not just irresponsible, it was criminally so. Even his co-worker Steinmetz had admitted that they had suspected that Mueller's wayward bullet might have played a role in the demise of the man in room 348. Even if Greg's death had originally been classified as a heart attack, which of course it wasn't, but even if it had been, the disorienting shock of a bullet tearing through the wall could easily have been the trigger. And yet, after the coroner had initially ruled blunt force trauma as the cause, Mueller had comfortably settled into the narrative, however implausible, that something else had killed Greg. He even went as far as to patch the bullet hole with toothpaste, a ludicrous attempt to paint over the cracks in his moral landscape, and a half-assed attempt to cover the evidence, that's for sure. The gun was hastily hidden, first in his car and then with a friend, before finally being handed over to an attorney for safekeeping. All this suggested one thing. Mueller was concerned, if not downright afraid, that the bullet from his gun had done terrible, irreparable damage. Had he come forward at any point before Detectives Brennan and Apple had cracked the case, a painstaking process that we know took nearly 8 months, it's possible that Mueller might have evaded a manslaughter charge or even imprisonment. Instead, he gambled. He banked on the hope that his connection to Greg's death would remain forever shrouded in mystery. And let's not overlook the fact that initially the odds seemed to favor him. Even after the connection was revealed, the county district attorney's office had been hesitant to escalate the case to a felony. The lesson here, albeit one learned too late for Mueller, is that the intricate mechanisms of justice, despite their occasional inefficiencies, do grind slowly, but exceedingly fine. It also offers a scathing commentary on human fallibility and the moral perils of gambling with someone else's life. Mueller's actions, or more precisely his lack of timely responsible actions, were a roll of the dice that had devastating consequences, not just for Greg and his grieving family, but for the very fabric of trust that holds communities together. It's an unsettling reminder that in the intricate web of human interaction, one reckless act can send ripples far and wide, altering the course of multiple lives. And while the courtroom verdict may have provided some form of legal closure, the moral questions surrounding the case remain unanswered, echoing in the corridors of conscience long after the courtroom doors have swung shut. But Detective Brennan wasn't the type to let the complexities of the law cloud the moral clarity of a situation. When he got wind that the prosecutor initially had been considering a plea deal for Mueller, he knew he had to intervene. He flew to Beaumont, putting himself directly into the fray between the forces of expediency and the demands of justice. There, he found himself in a meeting with Paul Noyola, an investigator for the DA's office, and Scott Apple. Noyola laid out the prevailing sentiments. Accidental gun discharges were not rare in Texas, and both judges and juries typically understood them. The Texas Criminal Code was admittedly vague on accidental deaths, which made the case look more like an uphill battle than a straight path to justice. Brennan was incensed. The stakes were higher than the inconvenience of a difficult prosecution. This wasn't merely about legal gray areas. It was about the glaring black and white of right and wrong. And so, the seasoned detective orchestrated a move. He brought Susie Flanagan to Beaumont to sit face-to-face with the assistant district attorney who was handling the case. However, this was not just about how the district attorney felt or what he thought the easiest path to justice was. He was in fact facing complications of his own. Mueller's gun was still in legal limbo, held by a lawyer who seemed ready to put up a fight before turning it over. It was as if the physical gun, ensconced in that lawyer's safe, was a metaphor for the moral and legal complexities that enshrouded the case. Yet, for Brennan, it was about breaking through the administrative fog to reveal the stark reality of a life lost due to reckless irresponsibility. His aim was not just to solve a case, but to serve as a conscience for a system that could sometimes lose sight of its fundamental purpose, justice. By bringing Susie Flanagan to that meeting, he was humanizing a case that seemed to be slipping into the abstract. He was making it impossible to ignore the devastating aftermath of one man's irresponsible choices. It's moments like these that challenge the judicial system, forcing it to weigh bureaucratic inconveniences against the incalculable value of human life. In the end, what Brennan represented was the unyielding voice of moral clarity amidst the murkiness of laws and codes. In a world where lines can often blur, Brennan's actions remind us that some boundaries should never be crossed. Brennan's actions speak to the need for vigilance, for the ceaseless questioning of a system that, while flawed, remains our best mechanism for balancing the scales of justice. And sometimes, in that delicate balance, a single voice, even a rough one with a New York accent, or perhaps, maybe especially a rough one with a New York accent, can tip the scales. The DA was reluctant to pick up the fight with Mueller's attorney to turn over the gun, but Brennan had had enough. I suggest you fucking go down there with a search warrant and a fucking blowtorch and get the fucking weapon, Brennan furiously berated the district attorney. It's evidence of a capital crime. What the fuck are you talking about? This was more than just an outburst. It was a crystalline moment of moral clarity. When Brennan mentioned the blowtorch and the search warrant, it was as if he was cutting through the red tape that so often shackles the wheels of justice. His words were not just an explicit call to retrieve physical evidence, but a figurative call to burn away the excuses, the delays, and the bureaucratic inertia that stood between the truth and its due consequence. The second part of Brennan's argument with the district attorney, which followed the pointed directive about the blowtorch and the search warrant, was equally impactful. Greg Flanagan, the victim, was important to everybody here, Brennan said, gesturing around the table, his eyes lingering for an extra moment on Greg's wife Susie. And we're not going to let this thing get brushed under the rug like somebody takes a plea on this. This is not a fucking accident. An accident is when somebody comes in, has taken off their gun discharges, and God forbid somebody gets hit. That's one thing. It's completely fucking different when somebody fucking brings a gun that they shouldn't have into another fucking state, shit-faced drunk, fucking around with the gun. Even the people around him realize that something bad could happen. He discharges a round, almost kills the guy he's with, and then he does kill somebody on the other side of the wall. He knows that's something that could happen. It's an occupied hotel. And then he doesn't even bother to knock on the door next door to see if anybody's hurt. And after that, his answer to the whole thing is to go get drunk some more in the fucking hotel bar. And then when he sees a body being taken out the next day, and he's 100% certain he kills somebody, he decides not to say anything but to run to his attorney and leave the fucking weapon in a safe, and the fucking attorney doesn't say anything about it either. You want to know what that is? That is fucking murder. So if you think we're going to forget about this whole fucking thing, think again, because that ain't fucking happening. It's crucial to understand here that Brennan was not merely venting his frustration. His words laid out a comprehensive indictment of both the act and the subsequent chain of negligence and irresponsibility. He dismantled the idea that it was a mere accident. Accidents are unfortunate incidents that happen despite responsible behavior. What Mueller did, by Brennan's account, fell squarely outside of this category. Mueller's actions were a cascade of deliberate, reckless decisions, each amplifying the risk to human life. The ensuing consequences were not just predictable, they were inevitable. Brennan's rhetoric served as an imperative, challenging the very foundations of a criminal justice system that was considering treating the tragedy as a series of unfortunate events, rather than a preventable crime. When he mentioned the phrase, "That's fucking murder," it became clear that for him, this was not just about what could be proven in a court of law, but what was morally and ethically undeniable. He was dragging the tragedy out from the murky waters of legal gray areas and into the stark light of moral judgment. Finally, the tone of finality in his last sentence, "because that ain't fucking happening," left no room for misinterpretation. There would be no forgetting, no brushing aside, and no trivial plea deals. This case had carved out a place in the ethical consciousness of everyone involved, a place where it would stay until justice had been finally realized. Brennan's words were not mere expressions of anger. They were a compelling call to action, echoing through the walls of that room and resounding in the minds of everyone present. This was a moment of reckoning, and, thanks to Brennan's unequivocal stance, it became a turning point in the pursuit of justice. In a courtroom packed with tension and raw emotion, Susie Flanagan delivers a damning oration that encapsulates years of anguish, frustration, and injustice. "I have waited over 2 years to look you in the face, eye to eye, and simply have the chance to speak directly to you," she says to Mueller. "You would never have come forward with the truth. You murdered him. No, you didn't intentionally seek him out to murder, but you murdered him, and every lie you told, with every intentional selfish deception, with every cover-up, over and over again, you murdered him. You saw his body taken out of the room in a body bag the next day. You knew you killed him. It meant nothing to you." The weight of these words, every syllable drenched in truth and irrefutable pain, reverberates through the courtroom. Mueller, taken aback, could only look shocked, an expression of surprise and dawning comprehension as the walls of his constructed reality crumble around him. Susie's words carry the burden of justice long denied. She is the voice of a man silenced too soon, robbed of his life in the most inexplicable of circumstances. As she takes her leave from the courtroom, her statement lingers like a haunting refrain. "You have met your match," she says, embodying the relentless quest for justice. "I would have spent the rest of my life tracking you down. And I found you, Greg's murderer. I brought you to justice." It's a moment of grim satisfaction for Detectives Brennan and Apple. They had pieced together the puzzle, faced bureaucratic hesitance, and fought against a culture that often dismisses accidental discharges of firearms as regrettable but essentially blameless acts. Over lunch, they consider the work that's been done and what lies ahead. Brennan orders a cocktail, a small but significant act of indulgence and relief. Apple, on duty, abstains. They plan to play a round of golf, return to normalcy, but a normalcy that's charged, this time happily, with the awareness of a job well done. This entire narrative reveals a broader, more disturbing reflection of our society. It's a tale that exposes systemic failures and cultural blunders, a legal system that's often too lenient or ineffective against gun crimes, a pervasive culture of firearms, and the high human cost of negligence. The story lays bare the dangerous norms that allowed Mueller to feel secure in his irresponsibility, to assume he could elude justice. It exposes, too, the shortcomings of the criminal justice system, where black and white laws often fail to account for the intricacies of human behavior and the devastating ripple effects of one person's actions. It's a cautionary tale, speaking to the necessity for vigilance in law enforcement, in legal interpretations, and in our own personal responsibilities. What occurred in room 348 is more than a tragic accident, more than a murder, and more than a criminal case solved. It's a piercing look into the cracks of a system and a culture that can still ultimately be overcome by the relentless pursuit of truth by those who care to look, who care to work, and to never give up, to always pursue justice. And in that pursuit, the most powerful force proved to be a woman motivated by pure love and an unquenchable thirst for justice. And I have no doubt that that justice still, despite her victory, feels somewhat hollow For even justice can never bring her beloved husband Greg back, but in her victory, we can find a semblance of hope that despite the flaws in our systems and in ourselves, justice, though delayed, is not forever denied. I'm Zevin Odelberg, and this has been Kinda Murdery.